Hello everybody and welcome back to a new video. My name is Sarah and today I have a very exciting video. I'm doing my top 10 reads of 2021. So these books are not necessarily books that were released in 2021. They were just books that I read in 2021. I will say though, roughly half of them were released this year while the rest are backlisted books. So this year I read 70 books, which I guess I only have 2020 to compare to in terms of like the years that I tracked my reading, but in 2020 I read 64 books. This year I read 70, and so these are my 10 favorites of those 70 books. Now I'm not going in like order from like 10, 9, 8, like ranking them that way or whatever. I'm gonna list them in the order that I read them. That way some of these books that maybe I haven't spoken about for quite a while on this channel get talked about first. So the first book that I read was Restless Slumber by KJ Sutton. This is the second book in the Fortuna Sworn series. Now I did read both this and Deadly Dreams, the third book, this year. However, Restless Slumber was my favorite out of the two. Don't get me wrong, I did really love Deadly Dreams, but just something about this second one just packed a bit more of a punch for me. Now, the Fortuna Sworn series is a dark fantasy romance. We follow Fortuna Sworn. She's a nightmare, and she is the last of the nightmares. And as a nightmare, she can like touch somebody and then sense kind of their biggest fears and then make them experience that. So it's kind of give them like illusions or visions so that they wholeheartedly believe that they are seeing or experiencing their worst fears. A couple years ago, her brother, who is also a nightmare, went missing, and she has been searching for him relentlessly while the authorities and everybody else has kind of given up. And so now it's present day, and she ends up running into a fae man who says that he knows where her brother is and can help her if she agrees to marry him. And so that's kind of where the first book picks up. This second book is kind of I feel like it's split almost into two parts. Not necessarily like two halves, but like there's kind of a distinct transition in this second book. So in like this first part, we kind of spend a lot of time with our characters processing and healing from, or at least starting to heal from, all of the very traumatic things that happened in the first book. And then the kind of second part involves a very wild left turn compared to where the first book was going that I wasn't expecting, but that I really loved because it just blew this whole world that Sutton is creating wide open and just added a whole nother set of like layers and elements to it that you can see are going to make a big impact once like the story veers back to the main storyline. I think that because we kind of took this left turn, like I said, we opened up a whole lot of like more world building, but we also allowed for a lot more exploration into the different characters and their relationships with one another. It definitely started to become a found family sort of situation, which I really enjoyed. You know, we strengthened a lot of connections. There was also a lot of tension that was added to a lot of connections. They're so like wonderfully written, these relationships, whether they're full of tension or not. They're just really engaging to read about. I really loved Fortuna as a character all through these three books, but just her journey through the second one, especially the end. The end of the second one is like so utterly painful to read. Like just from, I feel like the last 100 pages of like a decision that she makes split second that is like ends up being catastrophic, and then the resulting consequences and her then actions in response to these consequences. The entire time my heart was just like in shambles for her, and I think Sutton just did it phenomenally. There are lots of trigger warnings that go with this series, so please be aware of those. Sutton is very good about listing those in each of her synopses synopses right up front. This is just a very, very emotional series, but particularly this second book just had me like on the edge of my seat through that whole last like 100 pages, and then the whole rest of it I just was like thoroughly engaged with this story and with these characters and rooting for them and just really, really loving where this world was going. And the next book that I read that ended up being in my top 10 was The Mask Falling by Samantha Shannon. This should come to no surprise to anyone that this made it in my top 10. I absolutely love Samantha Shannon and the Bone Season series. It's one of my all-time favorite series. It is also set to be a 7-book series, and this is the 4th book. So since this is the 4th book, I'm not going to necessarily talk about specifics of this plot. So I feel like the Bone Season is always super hard to explain like what it's actually about. But the first book, basically, we are set in a world where clairvoyants exist, and they've always existed. And when I say clairvoyant, I'm not just talking like people who can like have visions into the future, but like people who more like interact with like the spirit world. But being a clairvoyant is illegal, and we follow Paige Mahoney. She is a very rare type of clairvoyant, and one day she gets arrested because she's caught as a clairvoyant. And then she gets sent to this prison, which is very, very different than what the general society thinks the clairvoyant prison is. And from there, the story takes a very drastic explosion into like what the story actually is. Most of the first 3 books take place in London or kind of these surrounding areas. In this book, we are in Paris. Between this one and the 3rd one, The Sun Rising, I can't really decide which one out of the series is my favorite, but I had so much fun with this book. Fun and pain. It was lots of pain, but also lots of fun. And this feels like it is such a perfect like transitionary book going from phase 1 to phase 2 of this series. It was so well done that I didn't even really recognize the transitionary period or like the whole transition of the story until I was done and thinking about it. We get so many answers of like questions that we've had throughout the first 3 books, but then there's a whole slew of other questions that now pop up from this book. I feel like this being the 4th book, you would think you would have a very good grasp on Paige and Arcturus and the rest of the characters. However, we spend a lot of time, particularly in the beginning, but just like throughout the entirety of the book, delving into Paige and Arcturus's characters and kind of how they're at this big changing point for both of them individually and as kind of a duo. We spend a lot of time exploring Paige's healing from the traumatic events that happened in the 3rd book in particular, and kind of the both physical and mental repercussions from those events. I think Shannon does a phenomenal job exploring trauma and kind of how a person reacts to trauma in different ways. It was like so suspenseful throughout the entirety of the book. Like we're exploring this whole new section of the world, Paris, and kind of the clairvoyant underground, but also the shady government side of Paris is like has its similarities to what we read in London for the first 3 books, but it's also very, very different. And so we get a whole new taste, and Shannon really stretched her wings with her world building. I've always loved her world building, and so it's just so much fun to see her get to really shine in that. There are so many twists at the end of this book that would just ramped up the tension even more than what I thought it could be ramped up, and I refuse to believe that what happened at the very end actually happened. I am struggling to come to terms with that, and I'm dying for the 5th book. I will be impatiently waiting for it because I absolutely adore Paige and Arcturus and just this world, and Shannon's ability to just really delve into the nitty-gritty of both the characters and the world, and yeah, I just really, really love it. Another of my favorites this year is another favorite author. This is actually a new favorite author, and that is Margaret Rogerson and her book Sorcery of Thorns. We follow our main character, Elizabeth. She is training to be a warden of a library. In these libraries, the books are all like sentient and alive. They're the libraries that require wardens are all filled with very dangerous grimoires. They allow sorcerers to access these grimoires. There's kind of like a negative connotation with being a sorcerer. They're seen as dangerous and kind of like unsavory. Elizabeth, training to be a warden, ends up being accused of releasing this grimoire, this very, very dangerous one, a high-level dangerous one, releasing this grimoire and killing one of the head wardens of this library that she's training in. And so she's accused, and she is then taken by a sorcerer to kind of the capital city to be tried for her crimes that she did not commit. I just absolutely loved this book. It has a very fun fairy tale feel. That's what I love about Margaret Rogerson and her writing. She just has her stories that feel new and fun, but have this like inherent traditional old fairy tale feel steeped into them. This book feels very whimsically gothic. The atmosphere of this is just absolutely gorgeous. I absolutely adored like having the sentient living books. It was so much fun. Elizabeth is such a fun character, and her dynamic with Nathaniel the sorcerer, as well as both of their dynamics with Silas the sorcerer's little demon companion, is so much fun. You've got Elizabeth, who is kind of like a stab first, think later kind of a personality. She's very brash, which is the exact opposite of kind of what's expected of a lady in, this is kind of like a Victorian era vibe. When she goes and leaves the library and kind of like ends up in the capital, she's expected to be like a lady, but she has never acted that way, and so it's just, she's a really fun character to follow. And then Nathaniel is more of like a let's step back and think about things first before we act, which is just a fun duo to have. The two of them end up having to work together, and then Silas gets thrown into the mix, and he is this very prim, proper, almost like butler-esque demon. He's so funny. He's a great character. He's got some really funny dialogue, and they're just an enjoyable little trio to follow. I just got so emotionally invested in these characters and this story, and just like the whole world and how these libraries are like alive, that it did make me cry at the end, but also it was just very comforting at the same time. I had a lot of fun with this, and I am really looking forward to Vespertine. And if you're looking for kind of a more whimsical gothic story with like a traditional fairy tale feel, definitely look into picking this up. Next, I read The Grace Year by Kim Leggett. Now, this is more of a dystopian novel, and I've always loved dystopian novels, and I've kind of strayed away from reading them, and so when I picked this up this year, I just immediately fell back in love with the genre, and this definitely is a very, very like powerful novel, and it has a lot to say. So we follow our main character, Tierney, and she lives in this community that is very, very traditional in terms of like women's roles and men's roles, and they have this like weird tradition where every year all the girls that turn 16 that year get sent away into this like isolated wooded area, and they have to survive there for a whole year in order to like banish their like evil magic that, because they're women, they have inherently set inside of them. If they survive and they come back, then that magic is said to be banished, and they are suitable to be wives after that. And so it's a very bleak like outlook on like, you know, being a woman. This is a very unsettling, eerie novel at times. What I really liked was like, it's obviously very filled with like feminist discussion points, but what I really enjoyed about it was how we look a lot at like how women end up getting pitted against each other, and how it's very detrimental to women and communities as a whole, to pit them against each other instead of like, you know, working together to better their situation as a whole. They end up competing against each other, and it was just a very interesting exploration that I feel like isn't talked about a lot, as opposed to like men versus women. It was more women versus women, and how there can be many like toxic relationships between women, and like just a inherent sense of competitiveness that is very unhealthy. Tyranny is also, like in this story, one of the girls that everybody sees as an issue because she's not submissive. She's always been very brash and kind of a bit of a wild child, similar to Elizabeth in Sorcery of Thorns. However, this ends up being very, very dangerous for her. But yeah, I just really enjoyed the unsettling, eerie, almost survival aspect of the whole middle section of this book, as well as the social commentary. I thought it was phenomenal. It was very well done. Some of the prose in this book is just super, super powerful. Tyranny as a character was fascinating to read about, and how she really had to struggle and come to terms with her womanhood, and also like what she was going to do about being a woman and having to either work together or pit herself against all of these other girls that are in the grace year. It was all just really, really fascinating. And I think if you're looking for a feminist dystopian novel, I think this one is a very interesting one to read. And I think it has a lot of really good commentary in it. Next on my favorites list is the first in a duology, and that is For the Wolf by Hannah Whitten. This is inspired by Red Riding Hood, however, it really doesn't go much past the characters being named after Red Riding Hood characters. So this is set in a kingdom where the royal family always has daughters, and the saying is the first daughter is for the throne, the second is for the wolf. And so we're following a set of twins, Neve and Red. Neve is the first daughter, and so she is already like the crown princess. She is going to be the queen. And then Red was born second, and so she is going to be kind of the sacrificial lamb to the wolf, who lives in the middle of this very unsettling, creepy, magical forest called the Wilderwood. And so the wolf is said to have captured the gods of this land and is holding them hostage and locked away, and so every second daughter that is born has to be sacrificed to the wolf, and hopefully one of these daughters will be deemed worthy enough to be an exchange for the wolf to release the gods. However, obviously, things are not always as they seem, and so Red actually goes and sets out as a sacrifice to the wolf, realizes the wolf is not what everybody says he is, and his whole situation with the Wilderwood and the gods is not what everybody says it is either, but nobody else knows this. And so the entire story, we're following Red as she is learning about her true purpose as well as the wolf's. And then in between chapters there are these like little interludes where we follow from Neve's perspective as she is taking her spot as queen of this kingdom, and kind of how she's growing into her role while also desperately working to get her sister back. And so Red is also working to get back to her sister while also trying to figure out how to kind of fulfill her role as the second daughter. What I think Hannah Whitten did phenomenally is like she writes these sisters so well, in this like relationship between the two of them and their love for the two of them and how they just want to be back together again. But also she writes it as they're both striving to the same goal, yet unknowingly like reversing everything that the other sister has done to get back to the two of them. And it's just, you can't help but root for both of them at the same time though, but you're also like, no, like you're undoing all of this work that the other sister has done to put into it. This is also one of the creepiest sentient forests I have ever read about. Sentient forests are one of my favorite like themes and like tropes in fantasy novels, and I think this is probably my favorite one. It was so unsettling. These trees have like teeth. I think they're just so well done. I love Witten's writing style. It's so gorgeous. It's beautiful. Her character writing is absolutely phenomenal. I absolutely fell in love with the wolf. He's so well done. It's just one of those like tortured soul characters that you're just like, no, it's okay, I swear. You're doing great, buddy. You're doing great. It's just so well done. I love Red and Neve. They're similar, but like opposite at the same time. And just the whole like sisterly bond was so well done. The magic in here is also super interesting. It's like, it's full of imagery and just beautifully grotesque to read about, and I really enjoyed this story. And like I said, this is the first in a duology, and I'm super excited for the second book to come out, especially with how this first one ended. This first one feels like a very solid entity on its own, but also sets up so clearly for the second one that it's just like, I need the second one now. I really had a good time with this one. So then another book with the word wolf in it is The Wolf of Oranjaro. This is the first book in a trilogy. So this is a very complicated political fantasy novel. We are following the Queen of a land who is said to have killed a man and banished her husband, the crowned king, on the day of her coronation. However, you know, that's not the case. You know, things get skewed, and everybody believes that, but that's not how it actually played out. 5 years after her coronation, she gets a letter from her husband who's hanging out in this other kingdom and is like, hey, I want to reconcile with you. You should come meet me here and we can kind of talk things through and figure out where we're gonna go with our relationship and also with the ruling of the kingdom. And so she goes to this other kingdom to meet with him. While they're in meeting with him, there is an assassination attempt and she escapes and ends up completely on her own in the middle of this foreign kingdom without her allies and surrounded by enemies, and has to find her way back to her kingdom, where even there, back in her home kingdom, most of the people there don't want her there and don't want her to be queen. I really enjoyed this novel. This is just full of twists and turns, and like, you're just as lost as our main character is in trying to figure out what to do next. She's, you know, flying by the seat of her pants throughout this, but I think it's so well done. She's incredibly clever, but also naive at the same time, which is like super hard to read at times because you're just wanting her to catch a break, and like you're wanting her to be able to trust in people, but sadly most of the time she cannot. The layers to this political story are just, it feels unending. I feel like it's so well done, so well put together, and there's so much tension in this novel. I was completely entertained from start to finish and just completely like roped into this story and invested in it. I love our main character and how she's written as well. I think that she's just so phenomenally well done because you see these two polar opposite perspectives of her. You see this like cold-hearted, brutal facade that she presents to the rest of the world, and at first you think that that's kind of how she actually is, but as the book carries on, you really start to get a good grasp of like her inside self and how she actually is and wants to be. She wants to be like just a caring, kind, trusting person, and she doesn't want to be brutal and ruthless, but she has to be because of the fact that nobody wants her to be queen, but that's kind of her role, and she has to be in order to keep this kingdom together and in order to fulfill what her father kind of set in motion for her. And I just really enjoyed how well written her character is and how complicated she is, as well as the complications of the political intrigue. And I'm really excited to continue this trilogy and hopefully finish it in 2022. So my 7th of my top 10 in 2021 is House of Hollow by Crystal Sutherland. This is a YA horror book. So in this book, we follow 3 sisters, and 10 years ago, they disappeared off like the street in seemingly impossible circumstances, and then a month later they were returned to the same street, but they could not remember what happened to them at all. But they returned, and like their hair color was different, their eyes were different, and they had this like otherworldly, unsettling beauty to them. And then in the present time, we follow the youngest sister, Iris. She's still in high school, while her 2 older sisters are like globe-trotting, wildly famous people. Gray, the oldest sister, is a fashion designer, and Vivi is like a world touring rock star. But one day, Gray goes missing, and so Vivi and Iris have to team up to kind of figure out where her sister is and what happened to her. And as they're figuring this out, they quickly realize that what happened to Gray in the present day is very closely linked to what happened to the 3 of them 10 years ago, which they don't remember. And so they're kind of going on this journey to not only find Gray, but figure out what happened to them 10 years ago. Sutherland's prose is absolutely gorgeous. It's eerie, it's grotesque, it's just so well done and gives such a thick atmosphere to this novel. If you like body horror and like plant-infused body horror, then I think you will really like this book. Everything is so like rich in imagery. It also has like a very dark fairy tale feel to it as well. The one part I was really nervous. I reached a point where I was like, oh no, is this gonna kind of just fall flat for me? Because we're kind of moving towards a direction that I kind of have expected it to move into, but then Sutherland adds in this one extra little twist that completely adds a whole nother like perspective and like unsettling, creepy aspect to the story that I was just like, oh, that's disgusting, but also like I love this. Overall, I just like have really enjoyed this, and I think if you liked Wilder Girls or Mexican Gothic, I think you will really enjoy this book. The 8th book in my top 10 list is Iron Widow. So this is a YA fantasy where we're kind of set in ancient China, but humanity is fighting against these like alien-like creatures in these giant mecha battles. The way that the mecha battles work is the mechs require a team of 2 to pilot them. Basically, only men are allowed to actually pilot the mechs, and they kind of require a woman co-pilot to be almost like a battery pack for them. Young girls are either sold into being a concubine for the male pilots, so they call them concubines, and they serve as concubines, but they also serve as, you know, these battery packs that get drained of their kind of energy and life force throughout these different battles. They can last several battles or just a couple, depending on how strong the male pilot is. But the girls are either sold to be concubines or they're married off to wealthy families, and those are kind of their 2 options growing up. So we follow Zetian, who is our main character, and her sister had been a concubine, but she had not died in battle. She had kind of died under mysterious circumstances outside of battle, and so Zetian's plan is to become the concubine of the pilot that her sister was a concubine for and get revenge for her sister's death. I absolutely loved this book from the very beginning because it is so steeped in female rage, and like the way that it's written, you feel Zetnien's anger. You don't just like, you know, read about it, like you actually like experience it yourself. You're feeling it, and you're like feeling angry like with her and for her for some of the stuff that she goes through, and like the things that other women go through. I also just really loved this world. It's just so fascinating how our author was able to take these like polar opposite kind of settings. Like you've got your futuristic mecha setting, but then you've got your ancient China setting, and they mashed them together and they just worked perfectly, and I just absolutely loved it. It was fascinating to read about how the author was able to make this work, and just the way that things were described. I really loved the author's writing style again. Like I said, it was just infused with his feminine rage and just like emotion in general. I thought that it was really well done. There is a love triangle in this book, and I typically hate love triangles, but the way that the author turned the love triangle into something that I wasn't expecting, I was definitely enjoying. I really love the choice that the author made. And then there's also a part at the very end. This book is pretty action-packed and it's very engaging to read, but the epilogue just absolutely turned the whole story on its head for me, and I was just sitting there like, what did I just read, like at the very end? And I am so excited for the second book. I'm not sure when it's coming out, but yeah, I just like the fact that I absolutely enjoyed the whole book itself, and then the epilogue was able to turn that on its head completely and make me love it even more, was just like really impressive to me, and I'm really looking forward to continuing it. So the next two books on my list are actually two books that I will be talking about in my December wrap-up, so I'm gonna be honest, I am just going to take those clips and put them in this video because I feel like I'm kind of at the end of my rope in terms of energy and explaining these, and I feel like I explained them well enough in that video compared to how I would explain them now. My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. This title, the title of this book, wins as best title I have ever come across. And then another quick note is I didn't really know what to expect going into this book, but I definitely didn't expect to like have my heart so emotionally like toyed with and like hurt as it was from the very get-go of this book. Like this book comes out punching. So basically we're following our main character Jade. She is just graduating from high school. She's a young Native American girl, and she lives in this small town in Idaho, and she is obsessed with slasher films. Doesn't matter what time period they're from, how well produced they actually are. You know, if it's a slasher film, she's seen it and she probably has the whole script memorized. She has a complete fixation on them, and pretty soon she starts to see the kind of telltale signs that all link to a slasher kind of starting to actually happen in her hometown. And so she's kind of trying to convince people that this is actually happening, and then also try to figure out like who is the slasher, and kind of what their motive is throughout the entirety of this book. However, we also spend a lot of time exploring Jade and as like a character and kind of her traumatic past. You know, she's kind of grown up always wanting a slasher to come to her hometown, and her fixation on slashers, you can kind of tell between like those two things that she's not mentally healthy. Like they're, you know, she's been through some shit. So what I loved most about this book is actually something that I often hate in many other books, and that is how this is narrated with a very conversational tone. I don't know if you've seen some of my other videos, you'll know that I often comment that like that was a huge downfall for a book, and why I didn't like it was because it was narrated in a very conversational manner. However, I think that that is such an integral part of this book. If it was written without that tone, a big chunk of this book would have just been lost, because we get such a good picture into Jade as a character and kind of her like thoughts and just like a really strong sense of her fixation on slashers and kind of like state of mind and her mentality of things and how she feels about not only her town but also herself, is just given to us through this conversational tone. Stephen Graham Jones did a phenomenal job with this, and I absolutely loved being able to just be right inside of Jade's head. So as we're going through this book, each chapter follows like what's happening in the story, and then between each chapter there is like a little essay that Jade wrote for one of her teachers, kind of giving a 101 crash course on what a slasher is and the different components of a slasher. And it just kind of adds a whole nother layer to her obsession with slashers, but also like gives little tidbits of her life and kind of the history of this town as well. I think Jones did a phenomenal job of giving us Jade and then breaking her down and like making her come to terms with like her own past, and kind of her having to face that eventually, through different things that happen in this book. And it was just so incredibly heartbreaking. I will say this book comes with a lot of trigger warnings, like a lot. There's suicide, there's sexual assault, gore, violence. I'm sure I'm missing some. I would definitely kind of look them up before going into this book if you're worried about anything like that. But I think Jones approaches each very sensitive topic in a respectful and well-constructed manner. When I say there's gore in this book, like I was shocked how gory this novel got, even though like knowing it was like supposed to be a slasher novel. Yeah, quite disgusting. But very, very entertaining. The one thing I'm still not sure how I actually feel about how like this book ended with like this big reveal of like what's all happening, like who the slasher is, who we can connect these murders to. I don't know how I feel about it. Like on one hand, I thought it was really well done. On the other hand, I was kind of disappointed, but at the same time, not really. I don't know, like I haven't been able to decide. But because even though I haven't been able to decide like how I feel about it, it did not lessen my enjoyment of this novel at all. I still really, really loved it, and I did give it 5 stars. I was surprised. I thought this was going to be a standalone. It does end in like a cliffhanger, and I looked on Goodreads and it is supposed to be a series. I think it's supposed to be a trilogy. I'm pretty sure the second book is supposed to come out in 2022. Honestly, I do think it does stand well by itself, despite ending in a cliffhanger. I kind of liked that it ended in a cliffhanger if we were to treat it as a standalone, but I am very, very excited to continue with this series. And then right after that, I read another 5-star read, and that is Legendborn by Tracy Deonn. This took me by surprise because this is very steeped in King Arthur, like the legend of King Arthur. I actually have like zero interest in King Arthur. I don't know why. I just kind of like avoid it. It's not something I gravitate towards, and so because of that, I had been putting off reading this book for a while, and I'm kicking myself that I put it off for so long because I absolutely loved it. Could not get enough of this story and the world and Bree as a character. So this is the first in, I think it's a duology. I know the second book is for sure coming out in 2022, and on Goodreads it only has the 2 books listed. So I don't know if that means it's only a duology or what. So we follow our main character, Bree, who is a young Black woman enrolled in this early college program at University of North Carolina, and she is grieving for her mother, who had passed away a couple months ago in a hit-and-run accident as her mother was driving to work. During her first couple days at this early college program, she ends up stumbling upon this event that is very clearly a magical event, and something that she's not supposed to be able to see or be able to remember. However, upon seeing it and remembering it, it kind of spurns two things. One being that she realizes what happened to her mother may not have been just a normal hit and run. And then two, she gains the attention of the secret society that is comprised of the descendants of King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table. And so then she decides that she is going to find her way into the kind of inner workings of the secret society so that she can get to the bottom of what actually happened to her mother. That's the basic premise of this book, but there's so much more happening in this story, and like, I don't want to say too much more about the actual plot because it was so fun and exciting to get to discover it alongside Bree. I think Bree is just a phenomenally written character. She is full of grief and anger at like not only her mother's passing, but also just like experiencing these things that young Black women often experience because of like the demographic that they're part of. And those topics were so well integrated into this story, into like the fantasy element of this story. It was so well done, and I feel like oftentimes it can be hard to take like real world topics and issues and like put them in a fantasy setting and make them feel so real and hit just as hard as they do like in the real world. I hope that makes sense, but it was something that I found really, really impressive. The magic system in this book is super interesting, and like, I absolutely loved the King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table aspect of this book. Like I said, it's not a legend or like an element of folklore that I typically like, but I had a lot of fun with it. Some of the twists at the end of this, like, they were so well done. You didn't really see them coming until right before they were revealed, and like, you caught on as to what was actually happening or the answer like right before it was revealed, and you're like, oh, it was heartbreaking. I remember reading, there was like a whole section in the end that I remember I made the mistake of reading out in public, and I was like trying not to cry. I was like in a coffee shop, and I was like, this isn't fair, not only for Bree, but the fact that I'm trying not to cry in public and I can't like properly just let my emotions spill forth. This book is just so beautifully well done. Tracy Deonn has such a compelling writing style. There's something about it that it just like right from page one, your attention is just like grabbed immediately, and she's got a way of like writing in such a quiet but strong way that it's like, pay attention to what I'm saying. And I don't know if I've ever really come across an author that has that same like pull to my attention in like the same fashion that Deonn has, and I just like was so impressed by it. I could not get enough of this, and I could not stop thinking about it after I finished it. But those are my top 10 books of 2021, and I just really enjoyed all of these, and I'd love to hear if you've read any of them, so let me know down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Here's to a great new year, 2022. Fingers crossed that it's a great year for everybody, a great reading year, just a great year in general. So again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you consider sticking around and subscribing, and as always, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!